In the year of 2508, an organization known as the Concordiance Extraction Corporation had been colonizing a planet in the Cygnus system that had been nicknamed as the Aegis Cluster. The planet had been known as Aegis 7, which had been heavily restricted to all space travel, business, or leisure. In this time in human history, the Earth and the many colonies had been under a severe resource drought. The CEC, to combat this crisis, had built the mighty planet cracker, the USG Ishimura, a massive ship that had the length of just under a mile, fitted with the most sophisticated facilities in researching new medicines, medical treatment, and life improvement therapy inside of its medical deck. Though being an impressive purpose, this had been the secondary use of the planet's cracker, hence the name. The USG Ishimura had been built in order to crack open planets, pulling the massive continent right out of the ground and into low orbit by the use of its gravity tethers, allowing the miners stationed on board to break the mass down, funneling the boulders into the smelting facilities and the many grinders, allowing the workers to collect the precious ore and minerals. However, something that no one had expected to find on this desolate planet was an artifact that Unitology had thought was once to be one of a kind, and lost to them. The CEC and the Church of Unitology would be notified by sending a video transmission to Earth, allowing them to view the discovery that had been made. There they could see the marker in all of its glory. However, where the marker on Earth had been documented to be black, this one had a devilish, reddish glow. The CEC would dispatch the most famous of all planet crackers to initiate the planet's crack operation and to transport the holy artifact to Earth. If only they knew the true horror they would be in for in the coming month. With the event of the planet crack looming towards the colony of Aegis 7 at high speed, the workers had initiated the extraction of the red marker from the base of its podium of rock that emitted the same reddish glow. Once plucked from the pedestal, they found the devilish monolith standing upon. A high-pitched noise could be heard whistling throughout the colony, with the noise echoing a sudden pain originating from the minds of the colonists. Among them had been a large group of Unitologists that had been congregating in the Union Square. Once hearing the noise and feeling the pain that came with it, Deacon Abbott would instruct his followers to listen to the voice of God and to prepare themselves. With the frequency slicing through their minds, they then begin pulling their weapons upon themselves and leaving the bystanders to bear witness to the unitologists blasting their heads wide open, with blood spraying out all over the surrounding area, with pieces of bone matter, flesh, and their brains coating the walls and floors of the district. After the following day, an electrical circuit would explode inside of the barracks. Doors in this sector would malfunction, with them opening before slamming shut, constantly moving backwards and forwards, ramming the frames of these halls. The circuit would catch on fire, burning the surrounding areas, trapping those who had been working there. Once word had broken out about the incident, first responders would race to the district. A couple of squads would prepare their equipment and suits before embracing the flames in their search for survivors of this event. A woman known as Jane Gauthier would be among the squads. There they would see the smoke crawling across the ceiling, wrapping around the halls, before seeing the flames they would have to fight. There they would begin to fight the raging inferno, while the other teams begin to search for those trapped within these halls. Throughout the facility, the screams and cries could be heard echoing through the ventilation system and the hallways, as if the smoke itself contained the souls of the victims it had been suffocating with its haze. The teams would be successful in extinguishing the flames and the survivors would be saved. However, Jane would walk through a frame of a malfunctioned door where she thought she had seen somebody on the other side. Once she had found the suspected victim, she would pry the door open, allowing them to rush to the responders. However, as she had let go, the door slammed shut, crushing her hand. Overhearing the scream that Jane had issued out, the other responders rushed to her aid, with their attempts to pry the door open, much like pulling her hand out of a crocodile's maw. Eventually, the door would crank and buzz before releasing its clamp on her hand. However, the damage would soon be assessed by the doctors, but all they could see were the 3 center fingers on her hand being mangled and hanging by a thread. During the night of Aegis 7, the Ishimura had arrived, beginning its hail upon the colony, informing Carfusia about their arrival. This is where the doctors would send Jane to the planet Cracker's flight deck in order for their scientists and medical staff to treat her. Inside the medical deck, a technician who specializes in prosthetics would be known as George Greggs. Here he would begin his shift by going over the cloning vats where newborns would be grown from single cells, all for the study of medical treatment for those who had lost their limbs in mining accidents and other incidents. Over the following hours, he would go over the paperwork and begin interviewing the miners who were in need of these new limbs. He would eventually come across a first responder who had flown up from the colony. As soon as he was ready, he would buzz the applicant into his office. As soon as the door had slid open, George could see that the next patient had been a woman. George would see her elegant physique, her long, smooth brown hair, Her eyes were green, almost like emeralds, and her lips were the same color as roses. She would rush over to George, bending down to grab his hand with her left hand. George would quickly snap out of his trance, feeling her soft hand holding his. He recomposed himself as quickly as he had been brought back to reality and begins to shake her hand. He soon lets go of her hand and asks her to sit down as he begins going through her file. Seeing her name was Jane, he would start by calling her Miss Gauthier. However, she would ask to be called by her first name, moving the bar closer to personal rather than professional. He would then push back, telling her to call him by his first name as well. Jane would then offer him to join her to smoke with her, but Greggs would decline. The two would begin discussing the incident in full, with George acting sympathetic towards her. With the officers she had lost in the barracks fire, the interview would continue, with George asking Jane if she is in pain. She would reply to him that the fingers don't hurt at all. In an effort to impress him, it had been clear that she had developed a thing for Greggs in such a short period of time. He wouldn't be impressed by this endurance, however, as he needed the information for his work to begin. He would explain why the pain in her mangled fingers had been important. He would then ask again while prodding them, and she would be quick to say that yes, she was indeed in pain, groaning as she spoke. The reason was due to the nerve endings. If they were intact and functioning normally, then the fingers could then be used as if they were her own. However, if the nerves had rotted away and weren't effective anymore, then the fingers would be nothing more than stationary prosthetics, unable to move alone. Suddenly, a call would come out of the loudspeakers asking Greggs to assist in another part of the medical deck. George would tell Jane that they need to reschedule the interview for another time. However, she wouldn't let him go that easily. She then asks him out for a drink, allowing him to ask the questions in the mess halls. At first, he would be hesitant, as she is a patient and he a technician, so it wouldn't be very professional of him to do such a thing, but she would twist his arm and he would then accept. As George walked into one of the mess halls, he could smell the food being prepared and served to the other personnel. Seeing the dimly lit bar with a thin haze of smoke lingering in the air, just shy of the ceiling, coming from the few ashtrays on the countertops, with people smoking their cigarettes and cigars burning. George was nervous enough about meeting Jane after hours. The bar had been packed, with plenty of witnesses to call upon if this was to lead into something serious. He began scanning the room, looking out for Jane, when he would see a hand waving at him, beckoning his presence. He began walking over to see Jane staring back at him. As he came around the corner, he could see her teeth emerge as she smiled to meet his gaze. She then got up and gave him a hug, thanking him for meeting her here instead of the laboratory. He embraced her for a moment before sitting down to see that she had already ordered a drink, a bottle of red wine. George would go over the briefing as she sat there, looking deeply into him, as if staring right through him, into his very soul, which would make him even more nervous, not so much on edge, but just overly cautious. She could see this of him, that he had been holding back, so she would ask him if he would like to go up to the observatory with her. He held off for a moment, before letting out a sigh as he says yes to her. They would get up and begin walking over to the deck, in an attempt to relieve the tension in the bar between the pair. Jane, however, would grab George's hand as they walked, solidifying what he had thought that this woman had liked who she was with, not merely toying with his emotions for her own personal gain, not using him for her own amusement. As they had moved into the deck below the crew deck to look out towards the planet of Aegis 7 in the direction of where the colony had been located, Jane would walk away from George towards the reinforced window, but only being mere feet away. George would begin to think of what he was doing there. He could get fired for this, for building a personal relationship with a patient. This was not at all professional. But soon Jane felt something sliding around her midriff, gripping her tightly. It had been George, hugging her from behind, holding her within his embrace as they both watched the beauty of this planet that was soon to be cracked open in the coming days. She would then turn to meet him and grabs the back of his head as she leans in, planting her lips over his. A moment of romance. They soon left for George's quarters, where the ecstasy he had been feeling would only become more intense as he began to fall for this woman he had only just met this morning. Meanwhile, the night workers had been getting to work over the fingers that had been left in a jar for them. In their work, they had scanned the jar to get the exact properties of the fingers so that they can create a similar formation as the originals. The following morning, Jane would be listed for reconstructive surgery, where the newly formed fingers would be grafted onto the nerve endings and reconnected into the knuckles. Unfortunately, at this time, the captain would issue a call to action for nearly all of the colonists that are fit to go back to the colony to do so immediately via a transport shuttle. As soon as Jane had come to, she would be ferried to a nearby shuttle and sent away. As soon as George had found out, he would be crushed as the woman he had been seeing had been sent away back to the colony. With this distracting him, his colleagues would begin to take note of his hysteria. They were all stressed with the weird dreams they had been suffering from. The headaches were intensifying with each and every day they brought the artifact on board. Some were even falling into depression, and others had spikes in sudden cases of dementia. The day finally came. However, for Greg's, it felt like it would never come, with the last few days feeling like he was in some sort of fever dream, with a hole in his heart and a depression growing through his mind. He just couldn't stop thinking of Jane. That night was truly one that he would never forget. She was the one. She had to have been. George at this time had been relieved of duty due to his poor mental health, but that wouldn't stop it. Nothing could. However, he would return this day. He would walk towards the observation deck, to where they had shared their first kiss together. He would then see the beams of light below his feet as the ship fired upon the colony, with its gravity tethers, with them impacting the soil of the planet in the middle of the settlement. George would then leave to go to the medical deck, holding his head in shame. Shame for losing his newfound love. Shame for betraying his work for fun. He should never have allowed any of it to happen. He knew of the consequences, but he still went ahead with it anyway. A few moments later, the planet's crack had pulled the continental mass into low orbit around Aegis 7, and George had managed to get to his office in that time. As he sat there in the puddle of his own grief for the loss of Jane, he would then get an idea. He began looking through the files of that day again until finding hers. He scanned through the pages until coming across her rig codes. He then fired the codes into the computer to begin a transmission to Jane. He couldn't stand it. He had to see her, to talk to her, to hear her voice, even for just a moment, as the static played with the caption telling him that the call had been still going through. It gave him a glimmer of hope. As the static played on the computer screen, it felt like it was going on for hours. He felt as if he couldn't breathe. The anticipation was too great. When the ship would be rocked by a sudden shockwave, lights began going out, some flickering, others snapping under the pressure, shattering into a million pieces. When the lights returned, as sudden as the shockwave had been brought to them, George then turned back to the screen to find that the call had been disconnected due to the sudden power outage. He finally gave in to despair and walked out of the offices and laboratories of his working place. He couldn't believe it. An hour later, he would be aimlessly walking through the hallways and corridors until he could hear a huge crashing and scraping noise coming through the ventilation system. Perhaps an accident, maybe. He then began hearing many and many screams coming from the main medical hub. He rushed through to see the many patients fresh from the market being sent through the following corridor to the ER. The wounds were horrifying, as if a beast from an old folklore had risen up from urban legends and savagely attacked people, ranging from lost limbs to gashes all the way to the patients severely bleeding with blood seamlessly flowing through the floor grates. All of this as a technician was too much for him to handle. He began to head back to his office. Overhearing the screams echoing through the halls, the cries haunting his journey. Never has this happened before on the Ishimura. He began thinking to himself when all of a sudden another crash came flooding towards him. Thinking that it was another crash from a shuttle, he began suspecting that something had truly gone wrong here and carried his concerns with him back to his office. When he walked through the deserted surgical wing, when the same crashing and scraping noise could be heard, but this time it had been followed by some creepy sounds that sounded like a wild beast was trapped within the vents. Transfixed by this, he stood still, staring up at the ceiling with a pit forming in his heart, a knot in his stomach, when all of a sudden, the creature bursts through the ceiling vent, slamming face first into the floor. Greggs would issue out a call to the creature, asking if they were okay, thinking that they could have just been some maintenance workers working on the inside of the vents. He then saw a few twitches, followed by a gurgling, choking sound, as the creature pulls its mangled and cold form up. All Greg could do was stare in awe as the creature rose up off the floor with blood dripping from its jawless maw, reaching up to over 7 feet tall. Greg's heart began to slowly beat faster and faster as his mind began making sense of what he had been seeing. With the blades of an unknown material sprouting from the palms, the stomach split open with 2 arms that looked to have belonged to a child emerging, the intestines dangling out between them, the hair being absent, and finally, to top it all off, the eyes. They were missing, leaving the once alive man with 2 holes where they once resided, exposing the rotten inner workings of the skull with a fluid discharge leaking from them. Suddenly, as the creature moved closer towards this man, his mind went into fight or flight mode. He soon turned to run as the necromorph issued a roar out, sounding as terrifying as a lion's roar would sound to its prey. George bolted straight for his office, seeing the necromorph over his shoulder, just walking towards him as if it knew that death was inevitable. And of course, the reanimated corpse would be the expert on this subject. As soon as George had made it to the door to his office, he activated it with a fumble. Seeing the loading symbol on it, he began screaming bloody murder, sobbing as he heard the pitter-patter of the wet and bloody footsteps of the slasher form, itching its way closer and closer. Suddenly, a crank could be heard, with the hydraulics kicking in. Lifting the door up, he quickly ran through, activating the door locking controls, and as the slasher had turned the corner to the door, it slammed shut in front of it, making an audible noise, signaling that the door had been locked from inside the room. After a few moments of waiting, holding his breath, hoping that the creature would give up on him, a metallic crashing could be heard as the necromorph broke through the ventilation shaft, and his presence had disappeared into the void of the past. Relieved of the horror's departure, he began sobbing to himself, asking in his mind, why was this happening to him? Why him? Of all people was this to be occurring to him? He would look to his shaky hands, shaking as if he was to have mild hypothermia. Feeling the heat of the terror, he could feel sweat forming on his brow. He then hears a noise that startles him, a beeping coming from the desk, coming from his computer. He walks over towards it, activating the screen to see the request forms for the rest of the organ replacements that were pending for the other colonists that were still waiting. His thoughts betray him as he begins thinking back to Jane, thinking of how they first met, inside this very room. He then looked over towards the shelves on the wall to see Jane's fingers where they should be, inside of a jar that held a liquid that was used to preserve them. As he was about to grab the jar, he became startled once again as he started hearing something familiar, a set of whispers coming from Jane. Maybe she was here. Maybe she had come to his rescue. After a few moments of responding to these whispers, he was met with, "Why didn't you save me?" He then overheard a loud roar coming from the adjacent room. Followed by a set of screams echoing through to his location. It had been confirmed that he was truly terrified. The screams would then fade, and then silence would fall upon him, with only the beeping and humming of the computers to keep him company, the bubbling of the liquid inside of the tanks holding the newborns continuing. Thoughts begin stirring through his mind of what had been transpiring outside, so much so that he would activate the computer holograms of the security cameras outside to see what was happening. The first showed the surgical unit he had ran from. Now it had blood all over the walls and floor and was lit by a flickering light. Suddenly, without warning, a hole in the ceiling formed and a corpse fell into the room near to where he was standing. He would let out a gasp as he shielded his eyes from the horrific imagery. The sudden impact of the dead crew member had caused the filing cabinet to shatter, and the vibrations had led to the jar on the shelves smashing onto the ground. The computer terminal would then bring up a set of transmissions of co-workers of Greg's calling out for help, pleading with others to send aid all over the ship, that these horrors in the shadows had been attacking the crew members, stalking them through the halls, hunting them, with each of these cutting off as the workers and personnel were killed. This would deeply shock George as he began to work out the grand scale of the event. It wasn't just him. This was happening to everyone. He then began hearing the whispers once more, this time asking why he wasn't there for Jane. More and more noises originating from the other corridors of the laboratories began getting louder and louder. Echoes of less fortunate souls. Screams could be heard. He could hear the whispers again. This time, it had been a bit more audible. Through the chaos rippling through the ship, the whisper would ask for Jane's fingers to be returned to their rightful owner. He would then look down to see the shattered glass of the jar on the floor, seeing the fingers not too long after the shards. He then bent down, kneeling on the floor as he collected the fingers, readjusting himself, before he was to be assaulted by a new noise. One of scraping and ferocious banging. It was time. His time, and he knew it. They had come for him. He would then hear an ominous dripping in his right ear. He looked towards the origin of this noise, of the dripping. The hole in the ceiling had begun to secrete a meaty, slimy, organic mass that pulsed with every second as it slowly slithered its way over the surfaces inside his office, sticking to the ceiling and crawling down the walls. Over the next few moments, George thought back to his time with Jane, wishing that she had been here to save him from these terrors, when all of a sudden, a video hologram began playing in the background. It had been Jane. George would spin around to see her. She would begin to thank him for the time she spent with him, stating that she enjoyed her time with him. As the video played, the banging on the door began to intensify, with the door becoming buckled. She continued by talking about their relationship they had together, ending it with how she felt. That she thought that her job in PSEC and his work on board the Ishimura would connect well, as she had finished breaking up with him. A set of roars and a sudden commotion could be heard on the other side of the transmission. She then looks towards her right to see the necromorphs slaughtering her crew members. She then began swearing bloody murder as the necromorphs began their open assault on the PSEC headquarters, ceasing the transmission with her many screams. Greggs would look to the fingers, seeing that these were all he had left of her now, but it wouldn't matter, as the door was nearly off of its hydraulic hinges, with the audible and twisted noises coming from the horrors outside. Greggs continued stroking the fingers before the lights went out, and the door shattered with the final blow. All that could be heard in the darkness was the slow, methodical approach of the twisted and disturbed forms of the necrotized corpses, before he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his chest. He would scream out in agony as the lights turned on once again, this time being dimly lit. He would attempt to push the slasher off of him, but was met with his arm being sliced off in a blink of an eye. With the rapid blood loss, his body would go limp in a matter of seconds, and the necromorphs departed the location as they continued their hunt for more victims. In his dying breath, all George Greggs could hear over the necromorphs departing was Jane whispering in his ear, telling him that now they will be together forever. He would then see that his arm was still holding the fingers in its grasp, but now several vine-like tentacles had been present, coming from the openings of the wounds, before he had passed out into the dark void of the dead space.